Welcome everyone to our study of Jakob Mipham Rinpoche's Sword of Wisdom. Oh, I forgot something. Hold on. There we go. So as always, kindly generate the motivation of bodhicitta, which is the wish to free all sentient beings from suffering, establishing them in freedom and complete awakening. So this is why we're doing this. We'll invoke Jakob Mipham Rinpoche's wisdom body, which abides inseparably within the core of our being, beyond time and space. Mipham Rinpoche and ourselves inseparable. Through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you opened the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. Today I thought well, I'm actually going to be changing the format slightly. The commentary that we have from Khenpo Palden Sherab is quite thorough and actually really helpful, but I'm just thinking it might be too much. It might be a little bit overload. And so what I'm going to be doing is essentially just sticking to the root text, extracting the quintessential commentary from Khenpo Palden Sherab, but not going so much into the details around some of the topics that he generously and kindly sort of elaborates on, because some of these are rather unfamiliar territories for most of us. And so I think to sort of get the picture of what we're doing with the study of pramana, with the study of valid cognition, I think it's helpful to sort of us actually in some way getting through the text. And in the context of doing that, actually just getting a thorough picture of what we're doing in pramana, and then the little details, they'll be so much more interesting when we have the sort of larger overview. So that's my thoughts. And also I wanted to just go over a few short articles today that that present a bit what is pramana. And let me just see here. Just a sec. Just a sec. So I'll begin with just giving a definition of pramana. And here actually we're drawing on the way that it's actually set in the context of Hindu philosophy, which really just means Indian philosophy. When we look down what actually it means here underneath Hindu philosophy, it says Samkhya, Yoga, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Mimamsa, Vedanta. You see, and these are actually all very different systems. So this is again where we have this sort of curious phenomenon that Songtse Rinpoche often talks about, how Hinduism is really just a label that was given by people from the outside with regards to all you could find in Hindustan. In Hindustan, that was that place across the Indus River. So it all sort of, that notion, that term itself, which of course is now part of our vernacular and completely legit, nevertheless overlooks the complexity of what we mean with Hindu philosophy. And in fact, by that definition, Buddhism is even part of Hindu philosophy. And as such, then, of course, there's places where all these different systems, you could say, they have their particular views and so on. And Buddhism is then also one with views that differ from most of the other systems. But that said, yes, it is part of Indian philosophy. Now, within Indian philosophy, then again, we operate with what we call epistemology. One is to know that we have knowledge of something. That's fine. But we need to make sure that that knowledge is valid. And that's what pramana is. How do we know what we know? So that's what we also have in is very prominent than in Indian philosophy, including Buddhist philosophy. So let's just see what they have here in Wikipedia, or Wiki1. This is just a way of presenting Wikipedia. And they write, pramana, Sanskrit, pramana, literally means proof and means of knowledge. In Indian philosophies, pramana are the means which can lead to knowledge and serve as one of the core concepts in Indian epistemology. Now, let me just stop right there and just make clear here, we're not just talking about something Indian. This is universal. You could set yourself up and say, I'm a scientist, but unless you actually really know what you're talking about, you can't really claim you're a scientist. Unless you could say done the hard yards of going through education, done your own research and so on, you're not going to be interviewed by ABC about, particular scientific matters. You simply just don't qualify. You haven't done the necessary research. You're simply not knowledgeable enough. You don't know enough. So we constantly operate with how do we validate something? And similarly, also somebody might say, my car is parked over there. And unless we go and verify that, we actually don't know. It can be very well, and it can be a trustworthy person, but we also want to validate. So we constantly operate with this validation of knowledge. It's universal. So it's important for us who are undertaking this study that we don't think we're doing a Buddhist thing or an Indian or Tibetan thing, but rather we're looking at understanding what is it that properly validates what we take as knowledge. So that's basically what we mean in general with epistemology, and this is universal across the Indian tradition. It's universal across the Western intellectual, academic, scientific traditions. So it's absolutely, and it's something that we use in our everyday life when we validate. What was it? I saw an ad for, oh yeah, it said, have you bought stocks? Have you bought stocks in A2 milk? If so, contact, it was about lawyers basically. You've been deceived. There's scams that happen. You need to validate. If somebody calls you up and say, would you like stocks in A2 milk? Then unless you really validate who is calling you up, you'd be very naive to start, handing out your credit card details, right? So pramana and validating our knowledge is important. And also, particularly when it comes to Buddhism in the modern world, it unfortunately lands in the category of religion, which unfortunately is associated with just believing blindly in something because it's convenient, because you like the guru, you're charmed by the guru, or you're charmed by the charismatic leader of the church, and so on. So when you're associating with religion, very often for the modern person, you simply lack valid knowledge. It's being a religious person nowadays is seen as being slightly naive, rather ignorant. Perhaps it's allowed, it's justified, and we refer to religions as the grand narratives of our culture, but it actually is not seen as being valid science. And that's where Buddhism, because it's a science that includes consciousness, it speaks of things that normally are the domain of religion. And regardless of what religions might or might not know, certainly in Buddhism, when it comes to the fields that are the scope of its science, which includes consciousness, it is founded on valid cognition. So that's the point we're making here. It is not just that we're adopting some nice views. It's not just that we're tagging along. It's not that it becomes an opinion. Like you can say, well, you might not believe in rebirth, but I believe in rebirth. We can't do that. Well, you can, but that would essentially not amount to valid input, a valid position. That's just saying I believe it because I choose to believe it, because I like the people who believe it or whatever. And that's fine. But we're not really part of a larger conversation. Then Buddhism will never take root within anywhere outside of the people who choose to sort of like the vibes and whatnot. So that's where this epistemic project is so important. So hence the Indians very wisely operating with a science, a valid science, and we also all acknowledge Indian mathematics is extraordinary. The Indian tradition, the Indian intellectual tradition is incredibly powerful. And so their epistemology, knowledge of what we know, is very important. The article continues, it has been one of the key, most debated fields of studies in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism since ancient times. It is a theory of knowledge and encompasses one or more reliable and valid means by which human beings gain accurate, true knowledge. The focus of pramana is how correct knowledge can be acquired, how one knows, how one does not know, and to what extent knowledge pertinent about someone or something can be acquired. Sorry. While the number of pramanas, ways in which we can understand things, varies widely from systems to system, many ancient and medieval Indian texts identify 6 pramanas as correct means of accurate knowledge and to truths. Okay, so the first 3 are actually part of Buddhist, the Buddhist pramana, and the others, they're interesting also in some regard. 3 central pramanas, which are almost universally accepted, which are perception, pratyaksha, which is us directly seeing it. I can see my hand. It's there. This is what my hand looks like. Then there is inference. Well, I can't see my hand, but I would assume that it still looks pretty much what it was before. I can infer it because it was there before, and even though I can't directly perceive it. We also talk about, for example, smoke as being we can infer the presence of fire. And word, meaning the testimony of past or present reliable experts. Well, you know, NASA has told us that they have a little rover up on Mars, and we look at videos from there. These could all have been shot in a studio in Burbank and what have you, but we nevertheless choose, some of us at least, to choose to trust NASA. And similarly, also when it comes to the testimonies of sages with regards to the nature of reality, we listen to them. But there's a point to be made about that. And more contentious ones, which are comparison analogy. I'm not so familiar with that. Postulation, deviation from circumstances, and non-perception, negative cognitive truths. Each of these are further categorized in terms of conditionality, completeness, confidence, and possibility of error by each school of Indian philosophy. And this is just like in Western science when we talk about, you know, validation of particular knowledge. Various schools of Indian philosophies vary on how many of these 6 are epistemically reliable and valid means to knowledge. For example, the Charvaka school of the Shramana tradition holds that only one, perception, is a reliable source of knowledge. So they would just say, okay, we can only rely on what we can actually directly perceive. These are also the ones that we sometimes refer to as nihilists, simply because they don't really include what is intangible. Buddhism holds too, perception and inference as valid means. Now that's interesting, and that's the first 2, direct perception and also what we can infer, the smoke that indicates fire. Jainism holds 3, perception, inference, and testimony, while Mimamsa and Advaita Vedanta schools of Hinduism hold all 6 are useful, can be reliable means to knowledge. The various schools of Indian philosophy have debated whether one or the 6 forms of pramana can be derived from other and the relative uniqueness of each. For example, Buddhism considers Buddha and other valid person, valid scriptures, and valid minds as indisputable. And we've seen this before. Remember what we established, what actually was scripture? That's what we regard as valid science. Not just like we would validate astrophysics, as when we have works by authoritative people on astrophysics or what have you, particle physics, when this is written by people that we rely on, let's say, you know, I don't know, physics, Richard Feynman, and we would say, okay, this person knows what he's talking about. There, we trust Richard Feynman, and that is because we have established that this man operates with valid ways to get to knowledge. Now, then it says here, as indisputable. So Buddhism also considers the Buddha and valid persons. You know, we read about Chögyal Dzogchen Lingpa's travels to the copper-colored mountain and so forth, yeah? So we consider that as valid person, and what he writes as valid scripture, the treasure teachings and so on, valid minds, they're indisputable. But that such testimony is a form of perception and inference, pramanas. And this is because we don't just say it's true because they said so, but because we have already established what are the premises of a character like Richard Feynman. The way he does science is reliable. The way the Buddha does science is reliable. The way Chögyal Lingpa does science is reliable. And hence we talk about valid minds, the valid scriptures and so forth. So that's a little bit from Wikipedia, and I wanted to also then just briefly go over this by a really brilliant student of Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche called Andy Carr, whose work contemplating reality we studied in one of the online study courses here a couple of years ago, and he speaks about pramana. So we say he's a Buddhist teacher in the Vajrayana tradition. That's true. But then again, as we all know, the approach in Trungpa Rinpoche's tradition of Vajrayana was very much founded on the solid foundations of the other yanas. So pramana, he says, is a Sanskrit term usually translated into English as valid cognition. The Buddhist study of valid cognition can be traced back to Nagarjuna, Vasubandhu, and other early Indian masters. Yes, that's true. And also particularly, notably, Dignaga and Dharmakirti. So these early Buddhist masters discussed sources and types of knowledge in their writings. The main Buddhist Pramana tradition dates back from the beginning of the 6th century when the master Dignaga articulated a comprehensive system in his Pramana Samuchaya, or Compendium of Valid Knowledge. This system was expanded upon and refined in the 17th century by another master named Dharmakirti, who composed 7 treatises on valid cognition, the most important of which is the Pramanavartika, or Commentary on Valid Cognition. Now, both of these works here, the compendium and the commentary, they are actually quoted again and again in Palden Sherab's commentary. These remain important sources for the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. The word pramana seems to be derived from the Sanskrit word ma, meaning to measure or ascertain, the prefix pra, meaning excellent or perfect, and the suffix ana, which indicates a method or instrument. So pramana is the study of methods for bringing about excellent knowledge. Understanding the methods we use to arrive at correct knowledge is fundamental to the Buddha Dharma because incorrect knowledge is the root cause for circling in samsara. So it's not trivial knowledge. It's not nerdy project. It's going right down to what really matters for everyone, everywhere, at all places. So that's where when we have an illness, we need to make sure that the medicine that we're applying is proper, that it works in the proper ways, that it functions, it has the right ingredients, and so forth. So that's where we're addressing the core issue of what drives suffering universally. And that's, again, part of the bodhicitta motivation that we bring to this study. In particular, this incorrect knowledge consists of mistaking what is impermanent to be permanent, mistaking what are causes of suffering to be causes of happiness, and mistaking what is not a self to be a self. And hopefully most people here will say, well, isn't that exactly what Sansa Rinpoche is talking about and what makes you not a Buddhist? And that is, these are what we call the three lakshana, or the three signs of what defines samsara, confusion. Put another way, the first link in the chain of dependent origination is fundamental ignorance, and this we've also looked at. Dependent arising, which is we looked at the outer and inner causes of dependent arising. The outer causes is there where we say, oh, the rice seed gives cause to the rice shoot, gives cause to the rice plant, and so forth. So we can see there's a chain of causes and conditions that bring about particular effects, and these effects become the causes for further effects. So that's on the outer level, and then on the inner level, and this is going back to the rice seedling sutra, on the inner level, this is how we come into being, how our existence in samsara as confused individuals are premised on the series of, you could say, a development of a confused condition. So that's where Andy then says, not knowing who and what we are and not recognizing the nature of phenomena. This gives rise to a basic dualistic split that makes self and its projections appear to be two, self and other, me and the other, this and that. Based on this split, karmic actions and all the other links in the chain arise, climaxing with old age and death. That then leads to, again, the perpetuation of the other aspects of the chains of dependent origination, and so samsara and samsara cycles on and on. The antidote for samsara, he writes, is correct knowing, and that does not divide reality into self and other, but sees suchness, things as they are, genuine reality. So this is where we need to understand what our confusion consists of, and what reality, how can we approach reality? How should we understand reality? Of course, we're not talking about that all of a sudden we can intellectually understand reality, but we can understand how we can extract ourselves from confusion and approach a clear, you could say, lack of delusion, in which then we can directly experience suchness, genuine reality. So this kind of knowledge, then, he says, this interrupts the karmic chain reaction and brings about liberation or nirvana. This is why distinguishing correct knowledge from incorrect knowledge is vitally important. However, so again, this is where we who are part of a modern context in which something like Buddhism is held to be just a set of beliefs and so forth, it's important that we actually are onto understanding what the Buddhist teaching is based on. And also it's helpful for us to see where there's flawed science, where there are flawed assumptions, where there might be assumptions about, let's say, a topic like consciousness that interestingly seems to be, for example, presented in the modern context as some sort of mysterious miracle that just happens out of, you could say, systems which are entirely unconscious. We can right away say there's a flaw in the science there. There's not a relationship in between cause and effect. And we're right now looking at how anything that exists within reality necessarily operates within cause and effect. So that's where we can begin to smell a rat. And that's where also you could say our reverence for otherwise established institutions of knowledge possibly begins to be somewhat relativized, and saying, well, that might be helpful in some cases, and there is valid knowledge out there. There's very valid knowledge about a number of things, but perhaps there's areas which are not, where the issue and the knowledge is not that valid. So, so that's where it's important to distinguish between correct and incorrect knowledge. He says, however, distinguishing these two is not as easy as you might think. This makes the study of pramana both difficult and profound. You can get a glimpse of this by thinking about the different ways you might know something. Excuse me. Okay, I think we're good to go. An obvious source of knowledge is direct experience. A traditional example used in pramana literature, this is what we talked about before, direct perception, right? I can see my hand. The traditional example used in pramana literature is knowing the taste of candy. To bring this up to bring this up to date, let's use a Snickers bar as our example. Anyway, when you bite into a Snickers bar, you know what the taste is. Yeah, you can describe it as sweet and crunchy and chocolatey and creamy, but that does not begin to convey what the experience is actually like. In fact, you can't share the experience with someone who has never eaten a Snickers bar through a description, no matter how detailed it is. Concepts and inference are also sources of knowledge. Even if you have never eaten a Snickers bar, you could get the idea that it tastes sweet and crunchy because it's made from roasted peanuts, nougat, caramel, and milk chocolate. Knowing what the ingredients taste like, you can infer what the combination tastes like. Well, this is not the actual experience. It is knowledge about it. Yeah. So another possible source of knowledge is trusted authority. So actually here, we've covered two: direct perception, you taste the Snickers bar, or somebody says, well, this is what it is. And you can kind of say, on the basis of these words, these signs, form a knowledge of roasted peanuts, milk chocolate, and so on. So that's inference. And then there's another possible source of knowledge, he says here, which is trusted authority. Much of what you know, you learn from people or institutions you respect. A science teacher, a parent, the New York Times, Buddha Dharma, or a scripture such as the Snickers Bar Sutra, where the Buddha say, "Oh monks, I will teach you about the Snickers bar. I will teach you about the taste of a Snickers bar. Oh monks, the Snickers bar is nutty and creamy and delicious." This knowledge does not come from direct experience or from your own reason, but depends on somebody else's understanding. This is where we listen to the Buddha. And still another way of knowing it, of knowing, is through analogies to things you've already experienced. You might learn about the taste of a Snickers bar if you were told that it tastes like a Milky Way, only nutty and crunchy. It's easy to see that the knowledge that arises from direct experience is very different from the knowledge that arises from inference, trusted authority, and analogy, right? So that's where we have the actual taste. Then there's a description of the taste. Then there's someone that we trust that describes it. Or we say, it's like this. So direct experience produces vivid, non-conceptual knowledge of its objects. The others give rise to general conceptual understanding. This is like the difference between seeing a movie and reading a review. No matter how well the review is written, it will never provide the rich visual and audio experience of the actual movie. In addition to helping us understand clearly the nature of the different types of cognition, Pramana clarifies what makes particular types of cognition valid or mistaken, untangles the complicated relationship between perception and conception. So let's say that I say, give me a pen, right? And you will have an idea of pen, and you'll look and then you'll give me a pen. But that object that we're using there has no reality of it. It's just concepts. Then when I hold the pen, that's very different. Then there's a direct experience. Until then, I was just talking, somebody very kindly hands me a pen and says, here's the pen. And I'm not seeing it, but I know there's a pen there. But then, and that's where there's an image, there's a conception in my mind. But when I then perceive it, then I say, pen. So that's where we work very validly with conceptions, but it's also understanding how how these actually constitute realities, and you could say are not, even though they're valid ways of knowledge, you could say perception trumps conception. It's more real, and there are ways in which we could say even our relationship to perception is colored by conception. So that's where pramana is very helpful. It comes into play when we, for example, have prejudice. We're not really seeing, we've been told something about somebody. And then when we see them, then we sit, and while we're seeing the person and talking with them, we have a concept in our mind that might set up, for example, barriers. Then afterwards, we talk with another friend, say, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I told you about this, about so-and-so. I was mistaken. No, that wasn't my other friend. And we realize all the time we've been sitting talking with that person, we've had a concept in our mind that actually filtered our perception. And we weren't actually relating directly to it. And then we were even told that it was flawed. Actually, that prejudice was entirely ungrounded. But regardless, we can see how conception gets in the way of our perception. And this is where we begin to arrive at valid knowledge. If we, for example, come across a great teacher by the Dalai Lama will be teaching about something, and we know that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is teaching based on scriptures by maybe Nagarjuna or Dharmakirti or whatever, and we know His Holiness is famous for being particularly knowledgeable about that, and that's where we will then sit and really sort of pay attention to it. But if we sit in front of somebody who's just come off drugs and they say, hey man, I just really had a great understanding of reality, then there's a very different sense of, the validity of what's coming across. And so we need to discern. We tend to be more, you could say, open, and we can learn more from authoritative sources as opposed to less authoritative sources. So he says, so by studying and contemplating these teachings and meditating within this understanding, we can begin to sort through our experience and see what is valid knowledge and what is confusion. Eventually, with the aid of our careful investigation, we can give rise to valid cognitions of impermanence and selflessness and the actual cause of suffering and happiness. So simply on the basis of that, we'll be able to understand our reality. So this is just an article from Lions Raw by Andy Carr. All right. So back to where we are. Let's see here. So like I say, I'm going to be going a little bit. I'd like to sort of hold us really to the root text, and possibly avoid some of the, I wouldn't say excessive detail, but I just think it could be a bit overwhelming with all the detail that the Khenpo generously provides. And of course, this also should be an incentive for you to acquire the book and if you're really, you could say, really interested in the details of this, maybe you're already familiar with this material, then you'd want to sort of get the more detail. But otherwise, I think it could be a little bit overwhelming, just information overload. So we are basically here just to sort of come back to when we are talking about these four reasonings. And this is what we operate again within science in the modern context, really understanding how something exists on the basis of, you could say, let's say we have a particular medicine. Somebody says we have for example, an inflammation. Somebody says, well, St. John's wort would be really good for that. And then we understand really that St. John's wort has particular properties, it has particular functions and so forth. And that's simply just where we can see that this medicine, it's valid because of what it's made from, and it has this particular effect. So we talk about these reasonings really as essential to us understanding anything. It is essentially, even though we don't think of science in these ways, maybe the way we were taught it in physics and so on, this is actually fundamental to the way that we conduct any kind of science. So that's where here when it says, when the collection of causes is complete, it functions to produce an effect. Each and every effect depends on its own specific causes. So we understand where things come from, and when things have arrived, when we have something there, we understand that its effect, its functionality is dependent on particular causes. It's not a mystery. So that's where we understand you could say the potency that something has for creating an effect, And when we have something, we can see how it's arrived from, what it's arrived from. So again, this is where we looked at this causal efficacy, simply just understanding how things bring about particular effects. And then also where we got to last time, then the reason of dependency is that when we have an effect, we understand that it doesn't just happen like that. You know, it doesn't come out of the blue. So he says, next, for the reasoning of dependency, all the various effects, such as sprouts of consciousness, are necessarily dependent on their own specific causes, such as seeds for sprouts, or sense objects and sense faculties for consciousnesses. So we don't all of a sudden, okay, let's say in terms of cause and effect, we do something, right? We might think, oh, I'll get away with it, we nick somebody's, I don't know, somebody's shoes. Okay, this is the hard truth, ladies and gentlemen. This might be very disappointing for many of you, but if you go to Tibetan monasteries, you can very likely come outside and discover that your shoes have gone missing, simply because somebody out there, some monk or maybe some other Westerner thought, oh, well, there's some shoes, they look a bit like mine and I need them. So all of a sudden your slippers or, whatever they are you're wearing might have been gone. That happens. And that's where the culprit clearly thought, oh, I'll just nick somebody's shoes. And, now in the future, the karmic result of that will actually be that the person in question might experience a similar thing. In this case, it's not too, you say, devastating, but that's where we might think, oh yeah, cause and effect, I can get away with it. Oh yeah, maybe I'll just embezzle, maybe I can, I can cheat in the accounts, and who would know? But it actually affects us. It creates the hungry, poverty-stricken mind that in the future will construct our particular situation. So what we do has an impact. And also where we are now, we might think, well, I'm just here and everything's hunky-dory. Well, that's because of past actions that actually created the circumstances for being here now. So when we're aware of that, we don't just take the fact that we might have a nice situation and think, well, it just, it just happened like that. It happened due to very specific causes and conditions. So that's where we look at these two reasonings really as a way for ascertaining not just karma as I'm describing it here, but in fact, anything from our gardening to our shopping to our cooking to our human relationships. So that's where our impact, what we do, matters, and where we are now are due to the causes that have led up to the present. So he says, next, for the reasoning of dependency, all the various effects, such as, I just read that, didn't I? Anyway, all the various effects, such as sprouts of consciousness, are necessarily dependent on their own specific causes, such as seeds for sprouts, or sense objects and sense faculties for consciousnesses. So when we, for example, have a particular experience, it's on the basis of the eye faculty meeting with an object, and that generates a particular perception. Ascertaining this constitutes the reasoning of dependency of effects. The Sutra of Definitive Explanation of the Intent, the Samdhyanya Mochana, the reasoning of dependency is the fact that compounded things arise from causes and conditions, and terminology comes from making designations. So that's where on one hand, we have the specific object. Here we have a compounded thing made up of various things. That's understood, and that's an actual direct perception. And then there's all the things that we label. That's just where we talk about pens. Well, good, make sure that you stock up on pens, before you do your writing retreat, and that's a very valid point. But there's not a single actual object involved. It's just terminology. It's just words. But we operate effectively with that. Okay, please feel free to type in questions. Oh my God, it's already. But this is important. So, okay. Now there's 6 causes, 6 effects, and 4 conditions. This is where I just made a little bit of an executive decision and said, this is going to go into too much detail. This is basically the science of understanding when you have a particular actions, what they lead to, when we have particular situations, where they come from, and what are the circumstances. And this is something that, for example, in Words of My Perfect Teacher, in the chapter of karma, it talks about the fully ripened effect, and it talks about the effect in terms of experience and so forth. There's various kinds of effects and also causes, and you could say that the study of karma is very much about these, but it's something that applies to everything. However, it's actually not intrinsic to the text. And that's why, while this is a very valid subject, just to sort of stick with the text, I'm just going to pass over that. And I think to some extent the implications will be clarified in the context of the text. But really just coming back to the four reasonings, which we've talked about before, which are the ones we've just been talking about, namely the causal efficacy and dependency. And then we're also going to look at the reasoning based on nature, simply just knowing how things are, just like people, looking into how they've ended up being like they are, or what their present actions are going to lead to. You're just looking at the people themselves. How is this person, knowing this person, or how is this, this area in town, you're in Los Angeles and you get off the wrong exit, could make a big difference where you end up, and so forth. So that's where you want to understand the nature of things. And this is actually very significant. It's there that we have the discussions of relative and absolute truth. And finally, we have the reasoning of valid proof. Again, the essential epistemology. How do we arrive at this? So just to sort of sum up the themes that we've looked at here, the purpose of the reasonings of causal efficacy and dependency. In the joint presentation of the reasonings of causal efficacy and dependency, we have completed the first part, what they are. Now for the second part, their purpose. So now we have an understanding here. This is also this is the pragmatic aspect of it. The root text says, therefore, by understanding correctly or incorrectly how causes and effects function, one engages in or refrains from activities. All the philosophical systems and fields of knowledge like artistry are also rooted in this. This is why cause and effect encompass all worldly training and the training that transcends the world. So ladies and gentlemen, like I'm sort of banging on about here, this class is that this is entirely universal, and it's so basic to our way of navigating, whether it's, you could say, the knowledge about the world, in all its sort of various aspects, from, you could say, just handling how to get around the neighborhood, or the refined aspects of artistry, or we're talking about the practice of the Dharma. All of this comes from understanding cause and effect, causal efficiency and dependency. So he says then, commenting directly, for the reasons explained above, the efficacy of causes and dependency of effects are correct. Causes do, so this is where we just identify, this applies. This is not a Buddhist thing. The Buddha didn't invent this. This is just how things work. The rice seeds will cause the rice sprouts. Rice plants don't just come about like that. They come about due to rice seeds. So this is not something Buddha invented. This is not something Buddhist. This is just good to know in our reality. So that's why we can say the efficacy of causes and dependency of effect are correct. Causes do give rise to effects, and effects do depend on causes. What is incorrect is to think that causes do not give rise to effects, and effects do not give rise to causes. And that's why we would say, oh yeah, I'll just do this, doesn't make any difference, that sort of thing. And the other one is, well, I just happen to be here. The sort of Heideggerian idea of thrownness, we're just here, that's, what can we do about it? So we are in every way empowered. And this is so empowering. there's the notion that actually we shape our reality. Our present reality, we're shaped by causes. By understanding how cause and effect works, one either engages in or refrains from actions in the world. We become discerning. We know what to do and how not to do, how to be, how to be cool, how to be skillful. This applies to worldly knowledge, such as artistry, as well as the other 4 and 5 major fields of knowledge: healing, language, reasoning with valid cognition, and the Buddhist teaching. The reasonings of causal efficacy and dependency also apply to the 5 minor fields of knowledge: synonyms, performance, astrology, poetics, and composition. So we would generally say, in the Indian context, somebody who was knowledgeable, they knew about the arts, they knew healing, they knew language, they knew reasoning, they knew reasoning with valid cognition, and they knew the Dharma. They also, and this for the reasons that this actually would be skillful ways of engaging with others. You could say the trivia knowledge, and from maybe an enlightenment point of view, but it actually enables to connect with others. And these are then synonyms, performance, astrology, poetics, and compositions. And even in there, there's a scripture that quotes how, just being aware how you can present in literature, you can present with particular, you could say, emphasis, difference in emphasis, or when you're performing, difference in voice, to know how to make people laugh. All of this is valid knowledge. It's about intelligently connecting, and of course, ultimately, to bring others to the path of enlightenment from the you could say Dharma point of view. These 10 fields of knowledge, along with all the Buddhist and non-Buddhist philosophical systems, are all rooted in investigation based on causal efficacy and dependency. Therefore, these 2 reasonings should be understood to encompass all training in worldly activities, as well as all training that transcends the world, such as the various philosophical systems. So I think we'll see if there's some questions at this point. Okay. Excellent teaching. Sorry to have to leave early. Okay, that's all. Okay, good. Any other questions? Isn't this great? Hey, we're doing something really valuable here. So, very good video today. I'm glad. Okay, I hope the sound is good too. I've had some issues with sound, as some of you know. It was a couple of weeks ago, I did a talk which has been named the mute talk. There's my microphone set out. If consciousness is dependently arisen, based on the presence of sense objects, sense faculties, there is no actual continuum. How does one moment of consciousness impact the next? That's a very, very good question. Well, the thing is, in relative truth, there's these moments that we link together and we impute. We fail actually to recognize that there is no actual continuum, and we then impute a continuum on these. So that's why, yes, one moment of consciousness impacts the next. That definitely happens. That's just like any object, any rice seed that leads to rice sproutness. But we also need to acknowledge that rice seed is not the same as rice sprout, that there's not something that carries on. That's the important point. This actually, if you read in the Rice Seedling Sutra and the commentaries on it, this is an important point. There's actually not a self. There's not a soul. There's not a continuous entity that leads on. So this is an important point. We all agree on that. In all the various territories, everyone agrees on this. So that's where the notion of continuity is really just imputed. Just like you'd say, well, there's rice, and for all purposes and practices, yes, of course, rice seed, rice sprout, and all this all belongs to rice species. but it is actually, there is actually no continuity that persists. But cause and effect, yes, that happens. Sprout, what's it called? Seed, sprout, plant, you know. It may good to acknowledge that validity still depends on belief. At least, in terms of acceptable levels of rigorousness of the validation process, but also in terms of the degree of acceptance of the inferences we draw from those processes. Absolutely. And that's, of course, what's his name, Karl Popper's great point about that science necessarily has to be falsifiable. So that's very good. In the sense that we need to be able to validate and we need to verify. And if we have something that can't be, you could say, falsified, we have a very problematic situation. Then we basically just have belief. And this is also where, you know, within Western science of consciousness and so forth, neuroscience and so on, there's a general acceptance that the problem with many of the modern positions on consciousness is that they actually can't be falsified. They actually operate within a particular metaphysical scheme. And this is within the academy itself on the topic of neuroscience, that there is this admission of the sort of lacking of the falsifiability of the positions. So this happens. And this, of course, we need to be aware of, that this can sneak into even the most sort of rigorous science. But of course, also we can operate with an understanding that relatively functions. So we can understand that when we boil water, then it's not really about belief. Indeed, if I said it boils at 100 degrees, someone could come along and says, sorry, mate, actually, you know, it boils at, you know, what is it? I'm not sure which degree it is, but it's under 100, right? So that's where we have a belief, but then again, we can validate that, right? But it's still there's still a belief that I can make water boil from 100 degrees. My knowledge around it can be, you could say, it can be disputed and we can test it and so on. But we end up having something that nevertheless is valid in terms of us navigating the phenomenal world. What will be interesting is that when we come to absolute truth, that's where we actually see how our knowledge is entirely contingent on just concepts, and that actually phenomena don't have any reality that we attribute to them, you know, fundamentally. So we would say phenomena haven't even come into proper existence as such. But that'll come later. But we definitely need to, yes, like you say, even scientific acceptance is probabilistic. So that's given in the nature of things. But of course, it's very important that we have some knowledge that we can rely on, and that we can then say that is valid. It doesn't exist within a realm of, you could say, just belief systems. So yes, we agree on that. That's why my moments of consciousness have no continuum. It's called confusion. Presently, we do have a sense of continuity. That's right. For example, in my ignorance, I think of Jakob as, you know, a phenomenon that just goes on and on. Even though if I were to investigate, there's really just a discontinuity that continues. But I'm imputing a continuum then that I cling to. So that's where we presently do operate with this, you could say, imputing or believing that there is an ongoing experience. Interesting, the ideas of conception and perception. When does conception become perception? It's actually the other way around. It's actually what happens is that perception becomes conception. It's like the first moment of perception. You could say we're closer to the object, and then we begin to elaborate narratives around it. It's thinking about something, not perceiving it with the mind. Well, it's essentially just it's concept. So that's where, you know, we look at an object. I look at this glass, and of course, I know the glass is here. I can think glass, but the moment that I'm seeing it, I'm closer to glass. There's more of a perception, but even that is filtered through my particular, you could say, shades of my concepts. Does consciousness depend on a body? If so, what is aware of being in the Bardo states? Or does gross consciousness depend on a body and storehouse consciousness not? You could say gross consciousness depends on a body, but again, the subtle consciousness, for example, that we have in a dream still comes with a body. So essentially the mind embodies. That's basic to the condition of the mind. Like when we talk about samsara, we're talking about relative truth. When talking about our reality in which we operate with a sense of self, we operate with a sense of identity that comes with the skandhas. And that's where even though the gross skandha in dream is not there, or rather we experience without the gross skandha form, there's still a subtle, there's still what we call a mental body that carries. And this also we carry in the Bardo. It's basically the nature of, you could say, the storehouse consciousness and the way that it generates sense of self, the basic split that is, the basic ignorance of samsara, in which we then carry ourselves as embodied individuals, whether we have a gross body, which is what comes about when we take rebirth, or whether we have a subtle body and just the mental body, which we have in the Bardo and the dream state. There's still embodiment taking place, as you could say, intrinsic to this condition of mind, the condition of samsara. Why Wikipedia says Buddhism accepts only 2 pramana as valid means to knowledge. It lost the other important 2 from the 4 reasoning. No, that's different. That's these fall under the 4th heading of the 4 reasonings. And when actually we're going to see there's more ways of there's more pramanas, but these are the basic ones. And even the last one, the scripture, we've already seen that what we refer to as scripture, just like we would refer to, Einstein knew what he was talking about. We'll read Einstein with great, respect and reverence, thinking, okay, really interesting to see what he has to say. So that's why we do rely on scripture, but only on the basis of there's only direct and inferential knowledge behind it. Yeah. Okay. All right. The Snickers bar threw me for a minute, but then I remember the old saying, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Even if someone next to me, even if someone next to you says, look at the duck. That's right. Well, that's again where we're validating our knowledge and beginning to understand, the nature of the duck and that particular kind of duck, was it a Danish duck or an Austrian duck or a, South American duck and so on. And they all have their particular characteristics depending on causes and effects, and they all have their particular impact in terms of the world situation. Yeah. So Buddhism has 3 pramana. Yeah, and also we talk about pramanas such as yogic perception, which is again when there's an insight by subjectivity that sees better. You can say when there's greater instrumentation, just like we look up at the skies and we can see sort of, with our naked eye, we can see a lot of stars. But if you have proper instruments, you can see far more. Okay. Okay, last question. Let's see here. Does that mean a mind has no choice to pass into nirvana if it has created the causes? And does parinirvana mean the extinguishing of all causes, even the most subtle body? Yes, but it extinguishes the deluded conception. So that's where we would say at the time of enlightenment, then the ordinary limited embodiment, the ordinary limited mind is no longer caught within the dualistic framework. And that's where then the manner in which enlightenment unfolds becomes infinite. and where there's the spontaneously, the qualities of the selfless nature of enlightenment is manifesting for the benefit of others. So that's why you could say at the time of extinguishing all causes of confusion, there is the sort of the unfolding of non-confusion, the awakened state. This, by the way, I'm going to be going over tonight. I'm just concluding the study of the progressive stages of meditation on emptiness, and that's tonight. Actually, we talk a little bit about how from the Shentong Madhyamika view, how actually all the, you could say, experience and causation of samsara, when it's no longer held within the you could say the boundaries of confusion, how the actual ground luminosity then spontaneously, no longer limited, and then spontaneously arises as the what we call the bodies and wisdoms of enlightenment, coming particularly from the Shentong camp, which is a very upbeat view on reality. Yeah. All right. So thank you very much for participating here today, and we'll conclude with dedication. Okay. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you. By the way, I'll put the 2 texts that I was reading, I'll put that up in the resource folder. Okay, thank you.